Ready? I don't think I'm on. Is this on? Yes, it does. Can you hear me now? Testing. There we go. We are moving through our series of exploring the 316's. And this morning we find ourselves in 2 Thessalonians 3:16. Some of these passages I've gone back and kind of looked at verses around them in order to pull that 16th verse into that passage. But this morning, this verse stands alone. It stands as a prayer. It stands as the benediction. It stands as the closing of what Paul is writing to this church in Thessalonica. And so, 2 Thessalonians 3:16 is where we're going to be. There have been several times in my life where I remember exactly where I was when I heard news that was important or would end up having historical impact. The first time that I remember this, I remember when my 6th grade teacher came in and announced that President Reagan had been shot. Some of you are thinking, oh wow, I forgot that he was such a kid. That's my one of my earliest remembrances of that particular event happening, of having that time and that place kind of seared in my memory because of the news that was being announced. I remember also when the space shuttle Challenger exploded in 1986. I can tell you where I was. I was walking down the halls in Robinson High School in between class, and over the loudspeaker came the announcement that the Space Shuttle Challenger had exploded, and asked for a moment of silence for those lives that were lost and families that were affected. I remember where I was when Rachel told me that we were going to have a baby. A life-changing moment indeed. And I remember exactly where I was. 15 years ago today, when I saw that, I turned on the TV just in time to see that second plane crash into the World Trade Center. Those are images for me that continue to be a part of who I am, that ground me. Those memories and those emotions that go along with those memories ground me, if you will, in a particular time and in a particular place. Every time I think of them, I remember standing there in shock and disbelief, standing in front of our television and going, this wasn't an accident. This was an attack. Somehow, those memories are so powerful that time doesn't seem to be able to dull them. I have no doubt that each of us here this morning have similar memories of events that have happened that have been historical and important in our own lives. In addition to these powerful memories, I'm convinced that there are certain passages of Scripture that God uses to help us in times of trouble or to convict us should we go astray from Him. Isaiah 55 that we read earlier, there were certain passages in there that I hear time and again from people. I hear folks talk about the word of the Lord will not return to Him void. That's one of those passages that people depend upon, that they trust that what God has said, God will accomplish. For the ancient Israelites, and even for Jews of today, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, is one of those passages. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. That is the call to worship for the Jewish people. Has been for centuries. For us in the Christian church. We might not be able to quote the Scripture in verse, but we remember phrases, especially from Isaiah chapter 40, verses 29 through 31. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might he increases strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, the young men shall utterly fall. But those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary, they shall walk and not faint. We remember those verses. We cling to those verses. Or the verse that kicked off this whole exploring the 316's, John 3:16. We remember these verses. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. While our passage of Scripture this morning in 2 Thessalonians may not immediately come to mind as one of those classic passages, what Paul has to say to these believers in first century Thessalonica needs to be heard by the church, by us, each of us today. Let's read 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 16. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace always in every way. The Lord be with you all. Not very many words in that passage, but wow, the power that's there. Obviously, the key word in this passage is the word peace. While Paul originally, when he wrote this letter, he wrote in the Greek language, and the word that he used there, the Greek word that he used there, where it has the meaning of having peace for a time or peace in a place, usually in between wars, because the Greek world was a very war-filled place. The real power of the word for Paul that he uses here would have come out of his understanding of what the Hebrew word was. The Hebrew word shalom. Paul was, after all, raised to be the Pharisee of Pharisees. And so he would have had in his mind, even though he used the Greek word, he would have had in his mind, I believe, this understanding of shalom when he wrote the word peace. May the God of peace, may the God of wholeness, the God who is unity, the God who is in all and is all. Shalom is that word of peace that means wholeness, stability, health, especially when it comes to our relationships that we have in our life. We've all been in those relationships before that haven't been healthy, haven't been stable necessarily. I thank God that we can also point to relationships in our lives that are healthy, that have brought stability, that complete the wholeness in our lives. I thank God for those relationships, and I thank God that that's the kind of relationship that he offers, that he invites each of us to come into with him. The reason that I tell you all this information about the word peace is because we usually use the word peace differently from how the first century Christians would have understood this word. Instead of having this idea of peace for a time or a season, as the Greeks would have understood it, or the idea of wholeness and unity and completeness as the Hebrew-speaking Christians would have understood it, we think about peace differently. To us, peace usually just refers to the absence of conflict or the absence of war. Now, we often think that our nation is at peace when our military is not fighting to defend our borders. We often think that we have peace in our communities when we don't see drug dealers on the corners or have to witness police shootouts on the news at night. Or don't read about our city council having a fight in the newspaper. Just saying. Exactly. We live in Robinson. We think we have peace in our homes when there are no raised voices or angry words being said. We often think we have peace in our church when we don't see any outward signs of discontent from anyone. But defining peace simply as an absence of conflict is confusing and misleading in our spiritual lives. Because, you see, the way God uses the word peace, the peace that God brings, is exactly opposite from the way that we often think about peace being. God brings his peace to those who love him, even while those believers are going through times that few of us would describe as peaceful. If we were to go around the world, if we had the ability to jump from country to country and church to church this morning, what an amazing trip that would be. But if we had that ability to jump from right here in Robinson, Texas, from our sanctuary here to a group of Christians meeting together in North Korea, hiding in somebody's backyard in a shed, or even somewhere else more private than that, for fear that the government was going to come in at any moment and take them away. Or if we could jump from there, from North Korea over to a church in another country, in a Western European country, let's say a church in France, and walk into that church and find that here we have a mixture, a blending of cultures and a blending of people far different from our own. And yet, even in the midst of the conflict, the cultural clash that can happen in a church, or jump into Sudan and again find believers being persecuted, children being taken from their parents being killed because of their faith. Again, we would see time and again, I believe, the fact of God's peace being present and being evident with those believers, in spite of the circumstances in which we would find them. See, peace is far more than just the absence of conflict. In fact, when we only define peace like that, I believe it causes us to become complacent, to become lazy, spiritually speaking. We forget that conflict can have its place in the Christian life. When we are brought into those times of needing and depending upon God, the loss of our health, or the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a job, some time of loss or grief or pain or something that we're having to go through in our lives, we are drawn back to that idea of, I need God's presence in my life. God's peace is what our spirits long for. And it is God's peace in our spirit and within our minds that remind us that God is the one who faithfully provides. This is true even when there is chaos and pain all around us. If we would take time this morning to read the rest of this letter, not just this one verse, but the rest of this letter, we would see that Paul was writing to a group of believers who had become very fearful. They were fearful. Excuse me. They were fearful that they had somehow missed out on the return of Jesus. In fact, Paul says back at the beginning of this letter that you haven't missed it. That the day of the Lord has not come and gone. Don't worry, you haven't missed it. We will know for certain when that day arrives. It won't be missed. Our passage, though, this morning, this chapter 3, verse 16, this passage that we're focusing on this morning is Paul's prayer for this congregation that has found itself in this midst of fear, in this midst of confusion over this issue. And again, may the Lord of peace give you peace, Paul writes. I believe that Paul closes this letter with a prayer to remind us of the need that we have of God's peace to infiltrate the fear and the faithlessness of these Thessalonians, as well as the fear and the faithlessness that we often face. To remind these folks that God's peace needs to reign in their minds, in their spirits, in spite of the circumstances they find themselves going through. Through this prayer, Paul reminds these believers of the very thing that we today need to understand. Spiritual peace is only available when we are trusting in Jesus by faith. Jesus is the only way for humanity to have peace with God. Apart from that, there is no peace with God. We can have no real peace in our own lives with ourselves or with anyone else apart from God. If we are separated from God and not in a relationship with Him, we won't have peace anywhere with ourselves, with others, with Him. The peace that God makes available to those who are placing their faith in Jesus is so much more than the absence of fear or the absence of conflict. It is the presence of Jesus. If ever there was a time in our nation's history where we, those who represent the Church of Jesus Christ, need to be living examples of God's peace, I think it is now. For our nation, 9/11 is a historic day, but we remember how so much changed in our lives. And today can also be the day that becomes memorable to us if we will repent of our sins and give away our fear and our faithlessness in order to receive God's peace, Jesus, in our lives. I'm not going to tell you that by placing your faith in Jesus that you will never have conflict in your life again. That would be a lie. After all, Jesus himself said that his followers will be hated and persecuted in this life. I will tell you, though, that by giving your life to God and walking with Jesus by faith, nothing in your life will ever be the same again. After all, God promises that when we keep our faith in him, we will have the presence of his peace in our lives, even in the middle of conflict and persecution and difficulty. And that is a wonderful promise to remember today and every day. Sean and Nathan come to lead